Hello, everyone. My name is Asaf. I'm a product manager in WeWork. And previously, I was a product manager for eBay and for a few other smaller companies. Happy to be here today. First of all, thank you very much for Product School for having me hosted on your platform. And today, I want to talk to you about a very tricky part of being a product manager that everyone encounters from day one. And this is about how much should we commit to when we actually start a new quarter, a new year. This is a process that I've seen in many cases being much more complicated than I think it should be. And I wanted to share with you a tool and a framework that I have built together with some of my peers over the years that has really helped us improve this process and get to a place where we're much more confident about what we're doing. So before we start, I wanted to see if any of these following scenarios actually ring a bell with any of you. The first one is we are at a week before the beginning of the quarter, and we have built our backlog. We talk to all our stakeholders. We talk to our teams. We have a long list of stuff that we can do. And now we're actually at the point where we need to commit to what we're going to deliver by the end of the sprint. And we're stuck kind of on the question of how much should we actually commit to. Out of everything that we can do, everything that we know, everything is super important. Everything has a stakeholder or a user or a customer that's waiting for it to happen and come out. But we have limited capacity and we're not exactly sure how much we can fit in. So that, for me, creates a very strong sense of anxiety every time that we need to commit to a new plan during the year. Now, let's say that we've came across this and we started the quarter. Now, so let's say like a month and a half into the quarter, someone comes in with a new request. That sounds familiar? So they come in and they say, hey, this is super important. This is critical. We have to add it to the plan. We know that you only committed to this and this, and we know that you're working in an agile process, but we really gotta get this done during this quarter. What can you do to help us? And so the next question is, how do we actually manage mid-quarter changes? And every time that this happens, for me, at least, it creates not only a sense of anxiety, but also a sense of frustration. Like, we have agreed that this is the plan, and we went over this again and again, and why do you come in mid-quarter and start changing my plans and make me, go through all of this process again just for this question? And sometimes the thing that they're actually asking us to add is very important, and we have to add it, but the question is, what's the right way to add it without just taking on more work and having our engineering team or whatever delivery team we're working with put their heads down and kind of absorb that hit. And then when we get to the end of the quarter, we a lot of times find ourselves in a situation where we didn't finish all the work that we had planned. Now, I don't know if there's any product manager anywhere in the world that hasn't experienced it, that always had perfect delivery score. And I would say that they would probably not commit to enough work if they had always had perfect delivery score. So then the question comes up, where did we go wrong? Why did we end up in a place where we started off with a plan that looked good, but eventually, we couldn't commit everything, we couldn't deliver everything that we committed to? And again, for me, this creates not only a sense of anxiety and frustration because I have to communicate that we haven't achieved all our goals, and I'm frustrated because of it, but also a sense of resentment. And resentment could go against our stakeholders that had pushed us to get to the place where we're at. It can be a resentment against my delivery team that they gave me wrong estimations, and we ended up not delivering, even though they said originally that we could deliver. But really, it should be, and I think should be, a sense of resentment towards myself, because I was in charge of the plan as the product manager. I was in charge of taking stakeholder requests, of taking delivery capabilities and capacity, and balancing those out to make them work. And I didn't do that right. So all of these negative feelings, anxiety and frustration and resentment, and they happen quarter after quarter, year after year. And in many teams that I started working with, I saw that this was actually a cycle that went on and on and on. And in some cases, it actually resulted in a lot of people doing kind of extra estimations or just beefing up estimations not to get to that point, and not really trying to be precise, but mostly trying to make sure they don't find themselves in that kind of situation at the end of the quarter. So then the question is, how do we avoid this? And basically, how do we get from a situation where at the beginning of the quarter, we have this huge roadmap and backlog of stuff that we can and should and might do, and end up with a plan, and a plan that's not only realistic, but a plan that we can execute on, and a plan that we can actually use to understand whether we're adhering to the plan, whether we are actually going to deliver by the end of the quarter. And if we're not, then a plan that helps us not only adjust to some of these changes, but also communicate them in a very clear and concise way to our stakeholders. So how do we get from one side of the screen to the other, from a backlog to an actual start that can work? And I wanted to share with you the framework and tool that I have been using for over 5 years with at least 6 different teams that have really helped us turn around our delivery accuracy. And just very quickly, why would you want to continue on listening to this talk? So some of the pros in using this: it is very quick and very simple to adopt and fine-tune to your needs. It accommodates any kind of roadmap, any kind of backlog framework that you might have, so you don't have to make any other changes anywhere else in your process. It really does apply to any kind of team, although I've only used it for engineering teams within software development, but it really does apply to any kind of team. And it really works, at least for me it did, and the 6 teams that I've used. And finally, it's totally free. So I'm gonna share it with you at the end of the talk, and you can take it and you can start using it starting tomorrow. Some of the cons, because of the way that it is built, you're gonna see that it doesn't sync to Jira or any kind of backlog or execution management platform that you have. That might mean that you will have some overhead in maintaining it, in keeping it, but I find that this is worth the investment, and you don't have to do it day to day throughout the quarter. You really have to do it mostly at the end of the quarter when planning for the next one. And it assumes a relatively homogeneous team, which means that most people on the team can do most of the tasks. If you don't have a homogeneous team, like if your team is built out of very strictly professional people, each one can do their own piece of the delivery, it makes it a bit more complicated, not unmanageable entirely, but it does require some more overhead. So let's get started. Basically, the framework has very simple 6 steps that are not going to be a surprise to any of you if you've done product management for over a year. Some of these may look even trivial, but I think that's the beauty of it. So most of these are things that we know we need to do. We probably do them, but the way that we do them might not lead us to the best outcome that we can have. And I think that's, one of the great things about this, that you don't really have to learn a new skill. You just have to learn how to manage your skills and your tasks in a more orderly way that will get you to the best result at the end of the way. So then the 6 steps are: set up the tool for next quarter. The tool is just a Google Sheet, and you will see how easy it is. Break down backlog items to user stories. So it does assume that you had some initial prioritization done within your backlog, and you know roughly what you want to get done. Guesstimate, which means that when you're at the beginning of the quarter, it's sometimes very hard for you to actually accurately estimate how much effort each task is going to take. So you need to do some guesswork, but it's good enough. Do the actual planning and plan your execution throughout the quarter. So it means not only figure out what you want to do, but you need to somehow understand how you want to order the work during the quarter. And eventually, and always most important in anything that we as product managers do, communicate it properly to your team, to your stakeholders, and make sure that they understand it. So let's dive in. Step number one, set up the sheet for next quarter. So I'm just going to take you through the different elements that we have in the sheet so you understand what they mean and how to use them. So step number one, you want to make sure that you account for every sprint that you have in the quarter, right? Very simple. So this is a January quarter. So we have 6 sprints, Q11, Q12, all the way to Q16. Just put them in. You don't have to think anymore. The next one is update the backlog next quarter column. This is going to be the column where you dump every piece of item, every piece of work that you're not going to commit to this quarter. And it's just going to be the backlog for your next quarter. List the capacity that you have per sprint and sum it up. You will usually have the same number for every sprint, but in this place, it's very important to account for any kind of changes in sprint capacity. So you will usually not end up with the exact same capacity for every sprint. And then sum it up, of course, and then decide on an appropriate buffer. So a buffer would mean how much of the total capacity that you have you want to dedicate to planned work and how much of it you actually want to put aside for any kind of unexpected stuff. And so when you set up the buffer here, it's like a decimal representation. So 03 would mean 30% buffer. So when you set it up, the size of it, if it's 30% or 40%, you would want to account for unknowns, tasks that you don't know if you want to come, if are going to come your way, or within each one of the epics, or even changes that may come in that you're not aware of. Estimation confidence, meaning how confident are you that the estimations the team provides are accurate. Research and learning, so any kind of research task, any kind of learning task that the team does not currently have the skills for and are required to acquire during the sprint, you will have to account for this as another unknown. So you would probably want to give it some more buffer. And then number of epics that you have and the capacity and the risk. So basically, number of epics that you have, meaning every additional epic that you take on holds some internal uncertainty. And the more of these you have, the more uncertainty you take on. So I've learned that usually when I start working with a new team, because I'm not really certain of the estimation confidence, I don't know exactly how good they are in estimating tasks, I would give usually a 40% buffer, meaning we would only commit to 60% of our capacity. And when I have a good running record with the team, I would usually lower that to anywhere between 20 or 30% buffer, meaning we would only commit to 70 or 80% of the total capacity that we have. Now, pro tip number one, we're gonna have a few of these during the talk, so keep an eye out for them. Be as accurate as possible when counting capacity. The reason being, this is the only part of this entire process that will be accurate. So again, make sure that you account for holidays, team events, personal time off that people may want to take or have already told you that they want to take. Make sure you account for all of those when you count your total capacity. That's going to be your base. And if you start estimating here, it's just going to add on to the total estimation error that you'll have. Step number two, break down backlog items to user stories. Obviously, we all know this. We call it slicing. We call it whatever you want, but it's basically the same thing. It means that when you estimate work, you need to be granular. You need to understand the specifics, the details for you to be able to more accurately estimate how much that will require. Now, when you do this, always start with your roadmap, okay? Even if you have a backlog, get back to your roadmap, see that you have the right mix of epics, the right mix of work that will take you to where you want to be at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year. And don't only take tactical stuff, take also strategical stuff, take platform stuff, tech debt, etc. But always make sure that you go back to your roadmap and that the list of epics that you have will allow you to progress in the right way and in the right pace to where you want to be. And then put all of these inside the tool. Okay, just list them, and then we're gonna start breaking them down into user stories. Now I'm calling this user stories, but it doesn't have to be a strict user story the way that we were taught to build, because at this point it might be too granular for you to be able to break down. Okay, Slicing is a lot of work, and slicing really needs you to understand the deliverables very, very accurately, but also the work required to get there. And that part, work required to get there, might not be able, you may not be able to do that at this point in time, right? It could be like 2 months before you actually get started with the work. And there could be a ton of other stuff that need to happen before you can get started. But what is important is that you very, very clearly define the deliverable, what we're looking to get, what kind of value we're looking to create, what kind of experience we're looking to provide the end user with, and then ask your dev lead, your development lead, or engineering lead, whomever your peer is, what do we need to do for this to happen? Okay, so this is the most important question, right? You tell them, what do we expect to get at the end of it? And then what do we need to do to make it happen? Now, it doesn't really matter if you're super, super, super detailed in this scenario, but it does require you to make sure that you account for everything that needs to happen. And then at the end, you should always add line items for ongoing stuff like maintenance, tech debt, support duty. It doesn't make any sense for you to discount them. They're going to happen. So you might as well put them into your plan and not rely on the buffer to absorb that kind of work. Pro tip number 2, always go back to your roadmap. Okay, similarly, as we've always started with your roadmap, we need to go back to the roadmap because we need to make sure that the deliverables, once we actually break down some of these epics, that we're not only progressing on a roadmap on kind of a declarative level, like, yeah, we're gonna do a new interface, we're gonna build a new experience, but does the deliverable itself serve you in the way that you want it and provides the impact that you need to? And it's always a good practice to do top-down planning in parallel to bottom-up planning and comparing results. Now, step number 3, after we listed everything we need to do, we're gonna start with guesstimation. And the best part of this is that this is not a product manager's work, okay? All we need to do here is sit by, look at our dev engine or engineering leads and just ask them the same kind of question. How much is this gonna take us, okay? What's important here is for you to agree on scope. As always, it's good for you to have some idea in mind of how much work you think it's gonna take, because sometimes if your dev lead estimates it very, very differently, it means that you didn't actually understand the same thing about what a done definition would mean for this epic. So make sure that you have something in the back of your head. But again, this is the engineering lead, the dev lead's work, and they will provide a guesstimation for each one of these line items. And don't forget to make sure your dev lead accounts for things like testing, integration, documentation, error handling, analytics, etc. Make sure all of those are counted in, and try not to list them as individual line items. And the reason is that in the next step, we would want to start prioritizing and trading off some content. And when you trade off a line item, you want to make sure that you also account for all the overhead that entails with delivering that. So you don't want to have a user story that says, build the API, then test the API, then integrate with the other team, and then write error handling for that API, because it's then going to be very hard for you if you want to write it off and delay that or deprioritize it to the next quarter to make sure you account for all the kind of dependent line items for that particular delivery. And the most important thing, don't overanalyze and don't overslice. And the more granular you do, the higher error rate that you will have. And this is pro tip number 3. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one ahead. So before we're going to pro tip number 3, look at this part of the tool, and this is the first place where you actually have the tool working for you. This part will sum up all the work that you had planned for the next quarter. So when you fill in these numbers here, this figure will sum up. And there is a very simple conditional format that says, if this figure 95 is more than the total capacity minus the buffer that you had estimated, it's going to light up red. And when this lights up red, it means you're over committing. And your goal in the next step, step number 4, is going to be reducing this number until it becomes black again, or until your total commitment is less than total capacity minus your buffer. Okay, so this is the first place where the tool actually works for you. And now pro tip number 3, too granular a plan will result in a higher estimation error. Now, this is something that I have experienced many times. It is based on a psychological theory that was articulated by Dr. Kahneman, which actually won a Nobel Prize and is a New York Times bestseller for this book that he wrote, Thinking Fast and Slow. He doesn't strictly say from a kind of a mathematical research perspective that too granular a plan will result in higher estimation error. But what he does say is that most people tend to underestimate tasks because it is usually difficult for them to consider the details required for that task. And what happens is that estimation errors don't tend to cancel each other out. Rather, they tend to accumulate, okay? Because they're always skewed toward underestimation, meaning it will take you more time than you thought originally to deliver every line item that you have on your plan. Now, there's kind of a curve that says, if you're not planning with enough details, you don't really understand what you need to do. But if you're planning with too many details, then you accumulate a lot of error by consistently underestimating each one of these line items. Now, not only from a mathematical perspective, but also from kind of a psychological perspective, if you have a plan that is super granular, it will create a false sense of confidence for you and your team and might bring you to a point where you decide to lower your buffer because you're saying, hey, I know exactly what I need to do, right? I have everything listed. I have everything estimated. Even, let's say my estimation error is 10%, but you really have no idea what your estimation is. So you would be inclined to reduce the buffer because you would say, why would I need a 30% buffer if I know exactly what I need to do? So that's problem number 2. And problem number 3, it is really tedious and laborious to do very thin slicing for your entire quarter, especially if you're a week or 2 or a month before the quarter even starts. You don't even know a lot of the things that you will need to be able to properly slice it. There's still a lot of discovery work. There are probably a lot of dependencies that have to happen before you can actually get in to the details and start slicing it. So really slicing it so far ahead of when it's supposed to happen really doesn't make sense. And this does add to your overall estimation error because there's very high chance that you will get it wrong. Okay, that if you do slicing too far ahead, you won't do it right, and then you'll be estimating incorrect things. So that's tip number 3, and let's move on to the planning phase itself. So now comes the hard part, at least for the product managers, okay? But in any case, we're doing it hand by hand with our dev leads, and this is where we actually have to make some hard choices, okay? So we need to remove or add, but the winking face means I've never, ever seen a plan that starts off with too few work that we need to add on. We always have too much than we can actually handle and we want to get done. So remove or add whatever content until you reach the total commitment of less than your capacity minus the buffer. So if we're at 120 with the buffer of 30%, you want to get to around 70 or 80 points. And if you're at 117, it means you are gonna grossly miss your target, overcommit, and under deliver. So then the trick becomes start removing items from your plan, okay? And there is no magic to it. right? You need to understand impact. You need to understand priorities. You need to understand capabilities in the team. You need to have implementation trade-offs, right? A simpler, more straightforward, and one that is more long-term, robust, and could support additional features in the future. I'm not going to go into this now. This is part of our day-to-day job. And basically, we have two options on how to do this. We can reduce scope either by removing entire epics, okay, saying we're not going to deal with this at all, or we can do this by reducing scope within an epic. So we're saying this epic has features A, B, and C. We're not going to do C because that's kind of a added value, but it's not part of the MVP. So we're going to delay this until the next quarter. Obviously, you can go in and you can say, okay, so I have a few options on how to deliver this value. I can do something very lightweight, or I could do something very infrastructure heavy. That's for up to you to decide. But this is the plan that we have to, this is the game that we have to play right now, and eventually get to a point where this figure turns black instead of red, which means you're inside your buffer and you're good to go. And most importantly, never force the estimations to fit your capacity. There is always this tendency, hey, you know, I see this, we originally estimated this as 15, but I don't really think it might be 15. Maybe it's 10, and then we kind of hit our goal. No, don't double guess yourself. Don't try to rethink yourself. The original estimate that you provided will probably not be accurate enough on its own. It's probably going to be an underestimation. Even if your dev lead told you 15 and you put in 20, it doesn't help you to go back and question yourself. So never change the estimations unless you really do figure out you've made a mistake and you need to change it. But never for the sake of reaching your goal and going below the designated buffer. Now, the next step is kind of optional, because I've seen that sometimes with the teams that I've been working with, we were able to skip this step and still get to a pretty high confidence with our delivery. But it is really recommended for you to do this. And even though it can be tedious to take the next step, it will help you surface additional constraints and problems in your plans, and it will help you to get to higher confidence. So what is the next step? Plan your execution throughout the quarter. So this is kind of a project management exercise. Okay, you're building your Gantt or your delivery plan or your execution plan, no matter how you call it. But basically what you do is you take each one of your user stories and you decide, when am I gonna do the work required for this? Now, because we have originally did not try to do this super thin and make sure that every user story fits into a sprint, it's okay if you spread it across sprints. You're assuming that once you actually get started, you'll break it down further into manageable pieces that can fit into each one of the sprints. So that's okay, but basically you just wanna put all of this capacity into your quarter and make sure that it fits, okay? And some things that you wanna account for. Deadlines. Is there a specific date that some epic needs to be delivered on? Risks and priorities. I would usually want to start with very important epics that I have some risk or that I have some unknowns with, because I want to capture this as early on as possible and have some time to manage it. Internal and external dependencies. Do you have another epic that's a prerequisite for another? Do you have an external team that needs to do some work for you to be able to do your work? Even if you have someone on maternity leave or someone going on PTO and they are only coming back to work on a specific date of the quarter, make sure you account for it so that you actually plan something that is feasible and that can actually be done. Availability of critical resources. It's not only people, those are the most important, but it's also, if you have some kind of support, if you have some kind of an external event that happens, like if you're working with some kind of a SaaS platform that you're dependent on. And eventually, dev readiness, meaning from a product perspective, are we ready to actually hand it off to the delivery team? when you're at the beginning of the quarter, most likely not all your epics will have all the PRDs and all the user stories and all the product work that needs to happen for developers to actually be able to take it on and start working. So if you have an epic that's not yet matured from a product definition perspective, make sure you account for it and the time that it will take you to get there. Lastly, review each sprint's individual capacity and adjust. So this is another place where the tool will work for you. Basically, it will do the same as the total quarter capacity per sprint. So it will count all the work that you're committed to for each one of the sprints that you have. It will highlight orange if you're at capacity, and it will highlight red if you're over capacity. Both of these you should probably address. So if you're at capacity, that means very likely you won't be able to finish everything you planned for in this sprint, and you will have some spillover into the next. And if you're over capacity, no question, there's no way you're going to do that. So again, start playing around with the numbers, and sometimes it will actually surface that even though the total capacity that you have planned for makes sense, you can't really fit that into the plan, because some epic may only, it would take 4 sprints, but the earliest you can start working on it is sprint number 4, where you have only 3 sprints left in the quarter. Or that some dependencies actually start becoming apparent only when you put everything on paper and saw how the plan looks like from a visual perspective. And so make sure that you account for it. If you need to, you will probably need to reduce some scope to make that plan work into the individual sprints. And lastly, this is a good sanity test. If you've done your work right, your last sprint should be empty or almost empty. And that's a reflection of the buffer, okay? So if you took a 16% buffer, okay, 1 divided by 6, and you have completely filled up all of your other sprints, your last sprint should come out empty. And if you took a 30% buffer, then your last sprint can come out empty, even if the other sprints are not fully booked for. So that's a very good sanity test. And that's also a very good way to plan it. Always make sure you have enough time at the end of the quarter to cover any kind of unexpected work that you had to do. Pro tip number 4, it is always better to undercommit and over-deliver than overcommit and under-deliver, okay? That is true in so many levels, starting from how your stakeholders perceive you, going all the way to how your dev team feels and is being rewarded at the end of the quarter. And just to frame it in such a way, if you overcommit, if you're lucky and you're delivering exactly on what you committed, then you're scored kind of on par, meaning, yeah, you did what you needed to do. Thank you very much. Let's go into the next quarter. Or you didn't deliver on what you needed to do, so that counts against you. If you undercommit, then the 2 results that can come out is maybe you have reached your goal. In that case, everyone's happy. Or most likely you will over exceed your goal, and then you get positive feedback. Okay, and then the chances of you not reaching your goal and getting a negative feedback are much, much fewer. And of course, it's only to the point of staying relevant. So you can say, I'm not committing to anything, right? So no one has any expectations of me, but then you're not relevant to the organization. So step number 6, and really, really the most important step for every kind of work that we're doing as product managers is communication, okay? Communication and organizational culture. These are the most important parts that we need to manage as product managers. And the initial commitment, some suggestions on how to handle this, given that we've already done the work that we've done, okay? So it's always the key, and remember that the way you communicate, that's the most important part. Everything we've done until here, that's supported data, okay? So the fact that we've done this exercise doesn't mean that the plan is locked in. When you communicate it, when you go and meet your stakeholders, your managers, there will be a discussion and there will be pushbacks. And you should consider your plan as the first draft and you should embrace that discussion because in a lot of cases, new issues will surface, new constraints will surface, and new priorities might surface, or you might have not understood priorities well enough. And it's always super, super surprising for me that when people actually see the plan and when people are faced with the need to do that hard decision of what's in and what's out, sometimes priorities shift. Sometimes, forcing that discussion and what's the impact will make people understand that something they've seen as very, very, very important, actually not that important if you consider it against other stuff that you have to do. So that's a super important part of it. Validate your assumptions, your constraints, your dependencies, the priorities you've assigned, the impact you're expecting to get, the other stuff that need to happen in the organization for you to actually be successful. And when you do address pushbacks, make sure that you account for a priority. And then when you're trying to figure out what's in and what's out, always make sure not to take on more work, but have a trade-off discussion, okay? You should never be in a position where they tell you, okay, so take this on additionally, okay? The type of communication is not what can we take extra, it is what do we take out of the plan in order for it to be able to push this in, okay? And when you do communicate it, communicate on a relative estimation and not on an absolute one, meaning you should never say Epic X is 50 story points, Y and Z are 25, so we can trade these off one to another. You should always say X is more or less the same as Y and Z. And why? Because if you're communicating on absolute terms, you're inviting a discussion on your estimations. And that should never, never happen, okay? Your stakeholders should never dictate estimations. They should never tell you, why is this 25 points? Why is this double the work than this is? Okay, please explain this to us. They're not part of that discussion, okay? And they shouldn't be. What they should be telling you is this more important than this one? And am I willing to take, to get this kind of impact while delaying that impact for the next quarter? And you're the one who's telling them what are the trade-offs. And then, we started off the quarter, but we're going mid-Q and we have changes. And again, changes mid-Q are unavoidable, but they are manageable. And that's what you need to understand. And you should have the confidence to manage them appropriately. And by doing the work that we've done until now, you have, again, the supportive data. You have the understanding of what actually needs to get done and how much will it cost us to be able to do these trade-offs. So, one practice that you can always take is you can set some kind of a bar that your team will accept added work even without trading anything out, okay? So you do take some kind of a buffer. You have some flexibility in your execution. And there's some stuff that, they're so small, they're not even worth having that kind of discussion. And it's up to you to decide how much. So, anything that's recommended less than 5% of your total buffer, not anything more than that, is something you can consider taking on without pushing anything out. But you will still have these big things that need to happen that we only learn about mid-quarter that you will need to address, okay? And for those kind of large changes, here's what you do. Basically, it's the same thing we've done as we did in the beginning of the quarter. We need to understand the general priorities versus existing work, right? We need to make sure it is more important than some of the stuff that we have in our plan for the remainder of the quarter. Then we need to request an estimation from the team. We obviously need to understand what needs to be done. We need to define scope, we need to define deliveries, and then we need to get an estimation back. And then we need to communicate, again, in relative trade-off terms, okay? We can do this if we push that one out, okay? And make sure that you're proactive in this state. Make sure that you're the one presenting the option and that you're not being dictated a new plan by someone from the outside who doesn't understand your estimation, your delivery process, the overall capacity that you have. And one more thing, try as much as possible not to deprioritize or descope work in progress, okay? That's not only something that's gonna derail your plan, it's gonna demoralize the team. It's gonna create some very complicated conversations with the stakeholders and users that are waiting for that kind of work that's currently in progress. The reason is that you're already starting the work, you're already engaging them. Maybe you're already doing user testing with them, and suddenly you're pulling the plug and telling them, hey, this is not going to happen because we pushed in something else. You might be totally correct in doing that kind of prioritization, but it's still going to create friction, which is going to be much easier mitigated if you haven't started the work on this already. And lastly, make sure you update your team, you update your plan immediately, okay? Whenever there is a change, go to your team immediately, go to your other stakeholders, which epics were deprioritized, and update them immediately, okay? Make sure that everyone are in the loop, because if you haven't done so, that's gonna invite a lot of pushbacks. If you knew about this 2 weeks ago, why didn't you tell me this to me in time so that I could prepare, right? You're not the only people who are working to get the company successful. The same way that you're building features, you have marketing people who are creating collaterals to market that new feature. You have salespeople who are actually promising customers this feature by the end of the quarter. The sooner you communicate the change, the easier it will be for everyone else to adjust as well. And then, the last thing I want to show you is that basically our tool supports multi-team quarterly planning as well. It's actually very easily extendable if you have a few teams that you're working with, that you need delivering on something together to get the end results. Basically what you do is that you create a new set of capacity and planning for each one of the teams that you have. When you assign the work, you make sure to assign it to a particular team. That way the tool will know to sum up the estimations to the proper team, not only in the total quarter capacity, but also in each one of the sprints, okay? And just a quick tip is that you should usually try to have epics fully assigned to one team, okay? As we're seeing here in Epic A, in Epic 1, because that will create a better ownership and more collaboration, and will just allow them to move faster than if they have to work with another team to deliver that same epic. But you don't have to. If you really, really need to, you can split up an epic by assigning user stories to different teams. Again, the tool will sum it up correctly, and you will see how much work each team has to do for the entire quarter, how much work they need to do for each one of the sprints. And some points to consider, again, very quickly when you're doing multi-team quarterly planning. First one, you need to consider the joint goals for the team and what each one of the team must deliver, okay? It's not only one team, and the teams could be collaborating on some parts, but have individual goals that they also need to deliver on. You need to account for them. Secondly is which team is best positioned to own each epic, and again, prefer not to split epics between teams. Number three, what are the dependencies between the teams, okay? So especially when you have multiple teams, they will usually do pieces of work that require some order in delivery, so make sure you account for that. Prefer an identical scoring scale, okay? So if you're doing poker planning, or if you're doing hours of the week or days to deliver, it doesn't really matter what format you use. Try to use as much as an identical scoring scale, because it's going to make prioritization easier, okay? Because if two teams can do the same kind of work, one team would estimate it at 10, another one would estimate it at 15. Only if they use the same scale can you actually compare them and decide which team is best to take it from an estimation perspective. All teams have to eventually commit together to achieve their joint goal. But eventually, each team is responsible to deliver their own commitments, okay? But this is very important. So when you do the planning and when you do the the commitment meeting with your stakeholders and you do the communication, you have to do this together. And if you had multiple teams with one PM, that would usually be easier. If you have multiple PMs for multiple teams, make sure you work with your peer PMs and you communicate jointly and you commit to jointly, and each one of the PMs takes ownership for their part of the work. And then lastly, make sure you account for joint team tasks, okay? So when you have multiple teams working on the same product, you will have knowledge sharing, integrations, end-to-end testing, and all kinds of tasks that actually need to happen when you have multiple teams that don't happen when you just have one team, okay? End-to-end testing, very easy when you have one team, very complicated when you have multiple teams. Make sure you account for that. And basically this is it. So you saw that we didn't have anything that was super, super complicated. We didn't have anything that you didn't already know you needed to do. I think really the benefit of this is just in the framework and making sure that you go through these steps and not forget anyone and go through the right order and then use them appropriately. And then one last pro tip number 5. I didn't address this, but really a lot of this is dependent on having accurate estimations by your team. And this is something that's very, very hard to get done. And especially as teams change over time, new people come in, some of the people may leave, and we need to adjust our estimations and make sure that we are estimating in a predictable way. And it doesn't really matter how many buffers we take. If we don't know how to estimate our work, it's going to be very hard for us to deliver in a predictable way. So I recommend, not going to go into this now, but I recommend that you go see Brian Croft's talk about 10 metrics that every product leader should know. He has a specific metric about product delivery predictability, where he explains super, super easy tool and approach on how to, over time, improve your team's estimation accuracy. So you can go see his talk on YouTube, or you can download his ebook where he explains this. Great talk, and just to kind of complete the picture for this. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't dump too much information on you, but you're always welcome to go back to this talk and view it again. You can download the Google Sheet template from the link that you have here. I'm going to share the slides with you after the talk. There is also a written reference for a step-by-step user guide in my blog, so you can go into there. Always feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. You have the link here. If you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, if you think I'm doing something wrong and you can teach me some practice that you have that will help me, I'm always happy to learn, and I always want to hear new approaches and new techniques. So I would really appreciate that. And that's it. Thank you again, Product School, for hosting me. And I hope that you'll be able to use this and improve your processes.